There's a new animal in our midst. It's called the internet. All our lives now converge on it. It's perhaps the greatest revolution that we've seen in recent time, perhaps in the last 100 years. And we don't quite know what to do with it. Over the last year, 2 years, India has been convulsed with debates over the internet, the use of the internet, control of the internet, and censorship. Today, to talk about this new medium that is changing our lives, that is changing who we are, we have two excellent and very young men. There is Sachin Pilot, who is, I think, tired of being described as the youngest MP in Parliament, the youngest minister. He was the Minister of Information and Broadcasting till about a week ago and is now the corporate minister. But I convinced him that there must be continuity and he can still speak on those things. So we have Sachin Pilot. We also have Ben Hammersley, who thinks that boxing is less violent than running as an ultra-marathoner. And when he broke both his legs, he took to being a boxer. And that's the kind of radical thinking he brings to understanding the internet and how an older generation, the pre-steam engine generation, must react to this new thing amidst us. So please welcome Ben Hammersley and Sachin Pilot.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners,
we shall overcome.
बंदूक इस्तेमाल नहीं की मेरा हथियार था सिर्फ कलम
That's our cue, Sachin. Act like a thinker. In many ways, Sachin, you've been at the center of some of the most heated debates in India, which, as I just said, was about control over the internet. So I wanted to start with you before we come to Ben, who's jumping off his seat to tell us what he thinks of the internet. Why do you think the governments and the state are at loggerheads with this new medium? What about it threatens established powers? What about it is uncomfortable?
Shoma, I think it depends on how you view this medium. Frankly, for me, as a person, I think it's one of the most liberating things that has happened to humankind in terms of being able to use the internet for communities as a village square where people can come and talk and discuss and deliberate and air views and breaking barriers. I think this has been far more phenomenal in its achievements than perhaps telephone lines and other things. Internet has become pervasive now. It's become part of our lives. One estimate says that by 2028, 5 billion people will be online. But while we still grapple with this new technology in terms of governance structures and in terms of rules of the game, how do you engage with communities, how much control governments have, what is the stakeholdership relationship with the people who manage this huge, massive canvas. Every country is evolving slowly as it moves along, and I think there are all shades of governments in the world. Even though I'm not a minister in this particular ministry, I just like to put on record that as far as India is concerned, we absolutely have no intention of any sort of censorship on the internet. There are some rules and regulations and laws that we've passed, which I think reflect the sensitivity of our large nation. And the idea is to have more young people come online and be as free as they can be. But if you do something on the internet that is internationally unacceptable, that is done with the singular focus of inciting hatred or racial disharmony or ethnic rivalries, etc., and that judgment call is not by the government. I think the court of law, the judicial system will see if that pertains to that particular law, and then law will take its own course. As far as we are concerned, as a government, I don't think the intent is to kind of block and sermonize and make sure that there are categories of people and kind of push people out of the realm of freedom of speech and expression.
I'll come back to some of that, Sachin, because as you know, they are contentious. But before that, Ben, you have argued that a wall separates the two generations, pre-internet and post-internet, and that almost all power structures in the world are almost dinosaurian in their inability to understand this new language. So can you tell us, how can this be bridged, and what is the way to understand the new liberties that the internet has provided?
Thank you. Yes, so this is a theory that I think holds up across every country, not just here in India or in the UK where I'm from, but also the US where I work and many other places, which is, it seems to me, the world is, certainly in Europe and North America, the world is split into two groups. The people who did the majority of their intellectual development before 1989, and those who did the majority of their intellectual development after 1989. Now, 1989 was a very important time. It was, of course, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, but on Christmas Day 1990 was the day that the first web server was turned on. And if you look at what's happened since then, we have gone geopolitically from a bipolar world to a monopolar world, and then now to a multipolar world since then. But also, the internet has come along, and every single thing that the web has touched since 1989, 1990, it has destroyed and rebuilt in its own image. Every industry it has touched, every social structure it has touched, every form of relationship, every form of politics it's touched, it has rebuilt entirely. Now, if you're a person who, for example, today is a senior politician or a senior general or a senior executive in a large corporation, no matter where you are in the world, you're more than likely to be in your 50s or 60s. Our good friend here is the exception, but you're more than likely to be in your 50s and 60s, and you're more than likely to have spent the time since the web happened not paying attention to new things. Politicians, for example, around the world are almost universally the sort of people who have their emails printed out for them. And this is, this is understandable because politicians are busy people, and the email is very complicated, and and they might get confused, and it's sort of terrible. And so what we have is this widening gap, simply because the people who are currently, through their age, in positions of responsibility, haven't had any. It's not that they're stupid; it's just they haven't had access to this technology because of for mere practical reasons. Now, that's a big problem, of course, in every country, because, especially in the democracies, because we have entrusted our future to people who are quite obviously confused by the present.
You can see there's a very appreciative audience here that is more technological than you give us.
I've written a book, and it's available outside at 1 o'clock. By the way, I'll be signing them, so
There are two or three aspects to the internet that I think we need to focus on today. One is about political control, but the great elephant in the room that no one talks about is the internet really that free a medium? Because there are very big corporates that are today shaping the nature of that medium. They have control over that data, and that's one kind of internet control that we need to discuss, and really how free that is. And the third aspect is the social aspect of it. And I think that is a very live discussion, because as Sachin was saying, and I'll tell you why I disagree with that, Sachin, but is there a case for saying that you have to be sensitive to cultural realities of a particular location when the medium actually is transcultural? And is it then beating the purpose of the internet to bring a transcultural medium down to local sentiments? And would you accept, Sachin, that too often, not just your government, but governments across the political spectrum cave in on this idea of respecting people's sentiment? In a country as plural as ours, there's about 3 billion varieties of sentiment to respect. Where does that leave freedom of speech?
See, that's an argument that we must come to terms with, because I completely agree with what you say. The idea of disbanding the barriers and letting people say what they want is the whole objective of the exercise. But also don't forget that the internet sometimes gives people the space and access to do things anonymously. What you can't write in a newspaper, perhaps you could do online. You know, with the cloak of anonymity on you, you're free to do what you want. More than that, I think sometimes there has been misuse also, and I think that's something that's not debatable. You know, there's cybercrime, there's financial fraud, there's impersonation, there's harassment, there's child pornography, there's illegal trafficking of drugs, etc., etc. So there are conventions and laws already made globally. Idea is, are they relevant? As Ben said, are we as a community of people who are in the business of making policy, are we that confused about the present? Do we not understand the retail end of internet and the back end of internet? And let me just take you one step back. The internet is, we take it for granted, it's like, it's like air and water. But someone somewhere must run this thing, right? And I just want the audience to know that the internet is controlled by an organization called ICANN, which is registered in the US. And it's a non-profit company reporting to the Secretary of Commerce in the US. The internet is run on root servers. There are about 12 root servers around the world. And they basically are the master switch for how this whole thing operates. And I've been informed that about 9 or 10 of these root servers are in the US, geographically located there. 2 in Japan and 1, I think, in Brussels somewhere. And my contention has always been that 2/3 of the people who will use the internet will live in Asia, Africa, Russia, China, etc., South America. Why should there be geographically controlled governance structures that are not equitable, that are, as of now, we've had no issues with the running of the internet. I think everyone understands it's free, it's fair. But who's got the finger on the master switch? And I think there has to be equitable participation of stakeholders, users, people, young people, NGOs, governments, whoever, so that we are able to then move into the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years where internet becomes pervasive, but equally accountable and responsible to everybody around the world. So there has been, of course, at the back end, the servers, the switches, the routers, where they're located. We are talking about the front end, what you see on the screen. Are the rules enough? Are you being funny enough? Are you being too sarcastic? Are you hurting my sentiments? These are all cultural issues we can deal with. But there are strategic, important issues also that, you know, the global community has to come to terms with. And I think these are parallel issues which I think Ben should write a book about as well.
Yeah. Well, in fact, Ben, that is a very valid issue that he's raised. You know, that today the cultural norm of the internet is actually dictated by pretty much the US. And in fact, recently, although we don't agree with what the government did, when they asked Google and Facebook to take off some of the things that was on their sites, they said they apply US standards to the material that they show. Is that a problem? And would you accept that that's a problem? And we've recently had this UN meeting where our own government has tried to create a 50-member country group that will have power over internet governance. And I think the criticism of that is that they've not taken NGOs and stakeholders and young people, but it's all government. But where's the bridge? You always call yourself the bridge. What's the bridge here, Ben?
So I think we're talking about a few different things and getting them confused. So let me try and unpick that. The first thing is talking about unacceptable speech online. The idea that I might say something online that you would find offensive, or somebody would find, you know, personally offensive, and therefore should a higher power, the government or whoever, step in and prevent me from saying that. There's something, and this is one of those things that, this is one of those bits of knowledge that doesn't necessarily translate across up to senior levels of people. is that we can talk about censorship of the internet as much as we like. We can talk about some mythical capability of the government to step in and prevent certain types of speech from happening in certain areas. But those things are technically not possible. And this is a very important thing to understand. I'm going to say this a couple of times in the next 10 minutes, I'm sure, but it's very important that you understand this, because it has very, 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 very important ramifications for the rest of your lives. By design and by the fundamental architecture of the internet, it is impossible to completely censor the content that travels over it and still remain a democracy. You can do it. You can do it. It is technically possible. You have to become North Korea. But now, when I say censorship, I mean blocking of any form of traffic, anything. So whether we're talking about speech that you don't want to hear, or whether you're talking about piracy, or you're talking about certain forms of pornography, or you're talking about copyright infringement, whatever it is you're talking about, if there is something that you say, this thing is happening over the internet and I don't like it and I want somebody to stop it, you can have that. Move to Pyongyang. But if you live in any other country, or if you want to live in a democracy, then you're living with this much wider internet. And if you live in the rest of the world's internet, if you live in the non-North Korean internet, then you can buy filtering software, but your 8-year-old son can get around it, right? And you can apply geographic blocking to content, but I can show you how to get around that as well. It's just mathematically, to go back to Marcus's presentation earlier, it's mathematically impossible to block content. And so what we have here for certain forms of speech and the bad things that travel over the internet is not a technological problem, it's a social problem. I'm forever being asked by parents, for example, what can we do about our child seeing things we don't want them to see? It's usually naked women. Seeing things we don't want them to see online. What can we do about the internet? The internet is bad. Now, that's not a technological problem, that's a parenting problem. It's the same thing. So we have to be very careful what we're talking about when we talk about the difference between the internet and it being a technological thing and it being a social thing. If there are people in your country that are saying bad things that you disagree with politically, then it's a political issue, it's not a technological one. And there's a very big risk, I think, that we, in attempting to solve social problems with a technological fix, we throw out all of the advantages that you get from the technology. The American State Department have this great phrase around this. They call it the dictator's dilemma. And the dictator's dilemma works like this. Imagine you're a North African dictator or a Middle East dictator. This, of course, happened. Imagine you're a dictator. You decide that you want to have all of the good things that the internet brings you. Trade and education and communication and being part of the modern world and pop music, right? All of those things, right? The football streaming. You want to become that person. You want to have that into your country. You can bring that in, but with it, you get everything else. And if you only want one thing and not the other, by design, the internet won't allow you to do that. You have to have everything. And so...
But Ben, very quickly to respond to what Sachin said, 2 quick issues. One is about governance, Mm-hmm. Are we meant to be comfortable with the fact that the internet is governed by such a centralized chain of command?
So this is an interesting thing. The ICANN management and the management of the root service, it's quite a technical argument, and I do have sympathy for around that. But I think I think for technical, I hate it when speakers say for technical reasons and then sort of wave it off. But for technical reasons, for these very architectural reasons that the internet is made up of, who controls those root servers? The fact that they're in the US geographically is basically irrelevant. And the people who are, the actual people, the people that you can meet, who run those root servers, and there are some in Europe, there's one in London, and they're in secret locations, but we know vaguely where they are. The people who run them are probably the least likely people in the world to be told what to do by the American government. They're deeply
You know who they are?
I know a couple of them, and they're all...
No wonder you're feeling privileged, Ben.
Well, you know, they're massively anarchistic. They're brilliant. But the thing, I think that, the thing that those root servers controls isn't a master switch to use that phrase. The internet isn't architected like a telephone network. It's not as if those 30 people got together, they could turn everything off. It just doesn't work like that. By design, the reason the internet is designed the way it was because it was a military project for the Americans in the 50s and 60s, and they wanted to build a communications network which could withstand a nuclear war. What would happen if we had a communications network where the whole of the eastern seaboard was destroyed by the Russians? Could we build something that should allow the rest of the American military to still talk to each other? And that's what they made. They made this specific way of data traveling around that doesn't require a single point. And because it doesn't require a single point, there's no way to turn it off. So it doesn't actually, I understand it from a geopolitical point of view, but from a practical point of view,
it's not possible to do. Yeah.
It's irrelevant. It's totally irrelevant.
Okay. Just before I come back to Sachin and ask him what you're suggesting, that we need to build a new language of how to deal with the internet, one more valid question, you know, which again, as I said, has been exercising Indian media and public, is, are there any circumstances in which censorship becomes justified? For instance, we recently had a spate of false information on the internet that actually triggered a physical crisis in the country. You know, there was a massive exodus of Northeasterners from a southern state in India because there was threat of violence. And it was like a contagion, you couldn't control it. How does one, is there a language to deal with that, which is not about censorship? And are there any circumstances in which you would say censorship was justified?
To take that backwards, are there any times when censorship is justified? No. Even if it was justified, it would be impossible. And we run the risk in every country, because we had similar rumors in the UK and everywhere else. Even if it was possible, we run the risk of allowing politicians and people in positions of responsibility to use the internet as this big box in which you can place all the problems and say, it's not our fault, we have no responsibility here, we have no responsibility to lead, we have no responsibility to provide good governance, we have no responsibility to fix our society because it's the internet's fault and it's Facebook's fault or whatever. And so, if you do have a situation where it's possible to create a massive panic by putting things online, you can do two things. Yeah, sure, you can try and censor it, and you can try and prevent people from doing that, or you can fix the underlying problems to society. And I would rather have people running any country, my own or India or wherever, who would want to fix the fundamental problems rather than just like taping over it with a bit of paper.
Sachin, that got applause, but you know it's difficult to fix underlying problems so easily or overnight. But what it might be easy to do, and that's something I'd like to put to you, is that why don't governments get smarter? Why don't they play the language of the internet? Why don't they counter-flood? If there's propaganda of one side, why not flood it with propaganda of another kind? Why don't you join the medium rather than try to stop the medium?
I don't know, Shoma. This is not a competition.
And you're too young to be defending an older government.
It's not about defending government, but it's a little bit more profound to be in government and to only hear one side. I know examples of people, of families, who have never seen what internet is, but their daughters and their relatives' photographs are morphed, their mobile numbers are put on the internet, they don't know who to complain. When you hear things like that, I don't want to be the guy who dictates, take that off, take this off. But I think I have a responsibility as a member of the government. I may not be in government forever, but for as long as I'm here, if those people have a grievance and they say, well, Mr. Pilot, you are the government. Someone is misrepresenting, putting mock photographs, putting details online, we're getting harassed and threatened, etc. What do? The police have no idea how to grapple with this crime. What do? All we have said is that if somebody complains on a social media website that this is something that is offensive to me, and mind you, most of these social media websites have their own rules and regulations, which are pretty comprehensive, I might add. They are supposed to either reply to the person, well, your complaint is nonsensical, it's fine to have whatever's up on the internet, on my webpage as a company, or I think you're right, it's harmful, it's insightful, it's illegal, I'm taking it off. But if they don't respond in yes or a no for days and weeks together, then I think the citizens of not just this country, but anywhere in the world should have the right to legal recourse. That, well, this company is not listening to what I'm saying. As a consumer, as an affected party, I need to have a court of law to take action, whatever the judgment will be. Some people have said to me, the judges in India don't understand internet, so they can't take a reasonable assessment of the situation. Fair enough. But then who will? I don't want to do it. I'm the government. I'm not the moral master of this country. There is a constitution. There is a court of law. There's a judge. You've got to have faith in some institution. And the fact is that if the courts decide, whoever the person is, lower court, higher court, Supreme Court, they say, well, this person was wrongly affected, and this company has a responsibility to either take off the content or to keep it on there. The regulatory framework to have, I think, is important. Whether it's used or misused is up for debate, and Ben can talk all about how we have to engage. But I, as an elected member of parliament, as a member of this government, I cannot not listen to those people who perhaps don't have any access to Gmail or Hotmail or Facebook or Twitter, but are getting affected. They are also citizens of this country. Just because they don't have the money, resources, or the best advocate in the country in their speed dial, they need some protection. And it's for those affected parties that we have a law in place. It is not to mandate every Facebook tweet or Google account, you take off stuff that I don't like. So there has to be a balance. I think you're right, Shoma, and I completely agree with what Ben said, that people are migrating out of the Northeast and leaving Pune and Bangalore, going back to Assam. It's not the internet's problem. It's our problem. I feel ashamed when someone has to leave their home or college and go back to hiding in their home because they feel they'll be attacked by somebody else. It's a problem of our society, of our country. But just because I can't fix it next Monday morning doesn't mean I allow the situation to get worse, knowing very well, sitting on this chair, seeing that these people, whoever they are, whether from within the country or outside the country, are using technology as a medium with a single-minded focus of threatening people, of making them run from their homes. I, as government, cannot allow that to happen. And I will do whatever it takes to protect those people till I fix the problem from fundamentals, right? But it's my responsibility, Shoma. It's my responsibility. If there is a riot, if an innocent life is lost, just because I could have prevented it, I can't sleep, I can't live with myself. So I'll do what I can without making it look like it's banned forever. There were riots in London 2 years ago. For 12 hours, every SMS, every internet, every mobile was shut off for 12 hours. There were riots outside Paris. It happens everywhere. The number of requests that the Indian government has sent to Google to take off content is 1/3 of the number of requests that Norway has sent after the incident of that white supremacy that happened. The government does not, but another problem. Here's something for you to think about, Ben. When I, as government of India, request Google, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, that the court in this state of UP or Hyderabad has asked this content to be removed, the compliance rates of the request of the Indian government or the Indian judiciary is not even 20% of the compliance rate from Germany, from Sweden, from France, from the US. If you believe that geographically having these root servers, which are really, honestly, you may call it whatever you want, if they pull the plug, it's all over. They're not enemies of mine, and I'm sure I can be trusted as much as you can be to house the root servers, but the fact is that the compliance rates of our requests that we make, according to our judicial systems, are not complied with. Everywhere else, the compliance rates are high. So there is some sort of disparity in who has how much leverage in diplomacy, in geopolitical terms. We're trying to make sure that there's more balance in how we govern the structures. Again, let me repeat, and I don't want to get more applaud than Ben, but I want to make people understand. It's not about sounding, I'm the champion of freedom, let internet do whatever it can. It should, it will. Nobody can stop it. If you think me or any other minister or any other government can actually stop the internet, it's impossible. And I'm spending billions of dollars to connect our villages. We are spending $6 billion to connect every village with high-speed optical fiber broadband. Why am I doing that? Because I want people to come online. I want people to watch football. I want people to get education, to get medical attention, which we can't afford to give. But if all the other crap comes with it, we'll have to live with it and make sure our society is mature enough to understand the nuances of shifting out and sifting out the bad stuff and keeping the good stuff. But you can't let people not have the right to ask for what they feel is harming them socially or personally. I mean, that framework of legal system we've got to have and protect.
Sachin, you opened a whole Pandora's box of questions, and one accepts that it's a complex situation. Just one other question to you before, and the bell is rung, is that do you believe that the government can misuse this? And I think what has created a lot of suspicion of the Indian government is the amendment rules of, I forget the year, 2011. They are particularly bad, Sachin, because they do not narrowly define under what circumstances censorship can happen. It has thrown every word in the Webster dictionary into what can constitute offense. And I think that is what is problematic. The fact that any minister could go and ask for a political cartoon satire of Sonia Gandhi or Manmohan Singh to be taken off as being offensive, that becomes problematic because it shows that with the baby, you'll throw out the bathwater.
Okay. Just one example.
And I said that on purpose.
Just one example of a printout of an email. I have that with me. It's a printout of an email that you were mentioning earlier, Ben. We as government have actually aligned our laws according to the Budapest Convention. There are some countries in the world that want complete dominance of the governments of the day to control the internet. We, and I'm saying this for record, India is against any such move. I used to have in my earlier ministry long discussions with the Europeans and the Americans. What we want is an enhanced cooperation where the committees that govern ICANN and the root servers should not be committee members who just basically have coffee and leave. They must be able to voice their concerns. And the Americans, the president of ICANN met me 2 weeks ago. He's very happy to have more Asians, South Americans, Africans on board, real power to be making people accountable if something goes wrong. We want a cooperative system of governance, not bureaucratic, not government-controlled, like the ITU, which controls the spectrum and the telecommunication services. But internet is far more changing, every 6 weeks. So you're going to have stakeholders, users, NGOs, and government representatives on the boards that control the system. So there's no question, let me reiterate, there's no question of the Indian government siding with those countries, one of them being North Korea, to actually control the internet globally through a bunch of bureaucrats that run things from Geneva or from New York. That's not the government's approach, and we are looking just for enhanced cooperation, and we have got support from across the globe on this.
Ben, very quickly before we wind up, you wrote a book about 65 things that we need to know 64. Now for then. Can you tell us 5 very quickly? Okay, 3.
Well, let me one of them is a fundamental understanding of the architecture of the internet. So as I said, it's impossible to censor. But another one is something that I think Sachin keeps coming back to, is this conflating ICANN with content on the internet. We've been hearing this argument for the past 10 minutes, so I need to correct something. ICANN is the organization which controls the domain name system. When you buy a domain name, benhammersley.com is mine, for example, that system is controlled by ICANN and those 10 root servers. That's all they do. They control the domain names. Any content that's on the internet isn't touched by them at all. So if you think that this argument we've just been hearing for the past 10 minutes is around offensive things on the internet that you see written on Google or Facebook or somewhere else, and you want to get rid of that stuff, that's totally irrelevant.
But where do you post it then?
Sorry?
I have to go to benzi.com and say,
yes, you have to go to the individual company, and the problem that you have, of course, you're right, the problem you have is that Google and Facebook
domain name, right? Every time you get on internet, you have to go to a web page, you have to go to a domain name, right?
Yeah, but the issue, what you're talking about is getting rid of content, and so the problem you have, you're entirely right, is that you have to go to Google or Facebook and ask them to take it down and use the legal procedures you're under. But this is, again, where we come to the issue that we already have in the majority of countries in the world, and I'm assuming you have it here in India as well, laws of libel and slander. And if you libel somebody, it doesn't matter if you're libeling them in print or online. There is a judicial process that you should go through. You apply to a court, a judge listens to it, and the remedy is achieved. And if it's libel, as in I say something that's fundamentally untrue, factually incorrect, then sure, of course, no person has no free speech advocate has any problem with that. What worries me, whether it's in India or any other country, is when that line is very fuzzy, and it goes from being libelous to being offensive to being something we're not quite into to being you're taking the piss out of our friends. And that's a very, very slippy slope that you can fall off very, very quickly. So whilst you say, and I'm not picking on you specifically, Sachin, but you're sat here and so, you know.
Go ahead,
so let's imagine it's another country, and imagine another government says, we want to prevent offensive stuff, whatever that means. And you say, but we're not censoring the internet, we're not building boxes that prevent, like the Chinese or the North Koreans do, we're just saying, you know, if it's offensive, we're going to have it taken down, or we're going to have the ability to put you in prison or whatever. Then the situation you have there is what is a chilling effect. It means that journalists and magazines who are dedicated to freedom of speech, or magazines that are dedicated to socially progressive causes, or just people with opinions, because the law is fuzzy and unclear and is a little bit suspicious, they find themselves hesitant to criticize people. And so, although the government might say, we don't censor anybody, effectively they are. And it's that lack of clarity that is a huge problem, not just here, but in many other countries as well.
You know, unfortunately, the bell has rung twice. There's just too much of it to discuss. Personally speaking, I think for a country like India, offense is a very problematic zone. I think the constitution needs to change. We are losing too many freedoms with the idea of offense, and I agree with you. The difference between factuality and offense are two very different things. We've got to live with offense, otherwise we're going to lose our freedoms. And the Godzilla better not be changed. Thank you so much. And thank you, Sachin, for hearing that.